So in case you don't know, in 2017, there was a study done in Great Britain. And one of the things they were asking about was loneliness. How much loneliness is there in our nation? What they were surprised to discover in 2017 is that 9 million of the country's population of 67 million felt lonely either some of the time or all of the time. Now, this really rattled the leaders. They're like, oh my goodness, look at how much of an issue this is. When you're talking about 13% of our population are feeling lonely, and a bunch of them feel lonely all the time. There's no break to the loneliness. They were like, we have to do something. And so they made this very kind of controversial decision that they were going to appoint a cabinet member position to address the issue of loneliness in Great Britain. So like the highest office that could be appointed by the Prime Minister. Now, here's my questions, because I read about this 2 years. I didn't hear about it at the time. I just heard about it recently, and I did some reading on it. So 2 years afterwards, they were trying to measure to see if the loneliness had gotten better or worse since the government stepped in. So I want you to speculate. Based on what you know, do you think that the government's involvement has made the lonely issue get better, stay the same, or no effect at all? I think most of us are smart enough to know that the government hasn't really had any kind of positive impact on loneliness in Great Britain, but it's a problem. And I do applaud them for actually seeing the problem and doing something about it, because it's not just a problem in Great Britain, it is a huge problem here in America. And we know that there are more and more people telling us every year among all the generations that they are feeling intensely lonely. Some of you know exactly what that's like, it's how you feel. And then all of a sudden in the middle of this, COVID happens, and now loneliness is skyrocketing. COVID didn't cause loneliness. COVID has just revealed how serious the problem really is, and it is seriously an issue. So why is it that we feel so lonely? I mean, we got millions of people in the country. We got social media, we got all these things. It's not helping. You know why? Because here's why. Look at what this one author said. Vulnerability is the driving force of connection. Vulnerability is the requirement for connecting to God and others. So in other words, what we want is to feel connected, because that's when you don't feel alone anymore. When you know that you belong and people got your back and they're in your corner and you've got these friendships or relationships. We want to feel connected, and connection never happens without vulnerability. You cannot be connected deeply with other people and protected. Can't be. You can't be. And since we won't be vulnerable, we won't be connected. And so we're going to continue to be more and more lonely, especially in America, where we tend to view vulnerability as weakness. You're weak because you were vulnerable. Or we're afraid of it. How many of you have ever shared a deeply personal thought or story with somebody else only to have them share it with other people? You ever have that experience? And it just hurts like crazy. And so what we do is like, I'm not going to let anyone hurt me like that again. I'm going to put walls up. Nobody else is going to get access to this precious heart of mine. Nobody else. I'm protecting it. And so we move away from vulnerability because we don't want to handle the risk of it. But the reality is, you only win at relationships and in life through connection, and connection only happens through vulnerability. Brene Brown is someone I've been talking about. I talked about her last week. I'll talk about her again today, because she researches shame and vulnerability for a living. She is a graduate level teacher at the University of Houston. She has written, her TED Talk on vulnerability is one of the most viewed TED Talks. She writes about this extensively. She is an expert in the field, and when she was talking about this, she wrote a book called Daring Greatly, because that's what it takes to be vulnerable. You got to dare. You got to be brave. And she was interviewing this person. Her name is Gay Gaddis. 23 years ago, she cashed out her IRA. That's all the money she had. $16,000 to start her own ad agency. 23 years later, I mean, talk about going all in to chase your dream. Take out all the money from your retirement account, start a business. 23 years later, she built it into the nation's largest advertising agency that is run by a woman. You're looking at the nation's largest. And so Brene Brown was interviewing her and asked her about vulnerability, and she said this: when you shut down vulnerability, you shut down opportunity. Just look at that. When you shut down vulnerability, you shut down opportunity. Some of you want the opportunity to be in a great marriage. Shut down vulnerability, and you do not ever have a chance at having a great marriage. Some of you want to have great friendships and close friendships. Shut down vulnerability, and you will never, ever, ever be close. Some of you want to have great connections with your children. Eliminate vulnerability, and you will never have it. Shut down, like he says, when you shut down vulnerability, you shut down opportunity, and that's exactly what's happened. And that's why some of you don't feel close to your spouse, and you don't feel close to your children, and you don't feel close to your friends, and you don't even feel close to God, because without vulnerability, there is no connection. So we're in this series called Winning at the Game of Life. And we started 3 weeks ago. Last week we started with part 1 of this, so we're going to continue talking about how to develop the skill of vulnerability. Would you please open your program, take out the notes that you're going to find inside, grab a pen. Welcome to those of you who are watching on YouTube and those of you who are watching on our website at PennyLChurchLife.com. I am so glad you decided to take some time out of your schedule to watch this or listen to it with us. The notes for this are right there on the website or in the description section on YouTube, and I'd love to have you follow along. There are some very important things we're going to be talking about today. Such an important subject. So let's jump right into this. First, I want to just start again by redefining what we talked about last week, what vulnerability is. Look at this. Vulnerability is the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome and you are showing up with the real you. And we just don't do that. Well, real you means your opinions, your thoughts, what you actually believe about what they just said to you or what just happened to you. You show up as the real you when you can't control the outcome. We just don't do this. We are very play it safe kind of people. I'm going to show up when it's not going to cost me. Other than that, I'm just going to keep it all protected. And so we don't do this. It's courage to show up when you can't control the outcome, and it's showing up with the real you. Now, why would you do this? It's because everything you really want is on the other side of vulnerability. Look at this. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love and belonging and joy and courage and empathy and creativity. It's the source of hope and empathy, accountability and authenticity. Now, look at that slide and ask yourself, are there any of these words that you wish you had more of in your life? And understand that vulnerability is how you get them. So we've been talking about how important this is. So now I want to actually show you how to do it. And that's what comes next. So number 4 on your notes, because 1, 2, and 3 we did last week. Number 4, you have to make the choice to be vulnerable. That's the only way this is going to happen. You have to make the choice that you are going to be vulnerable. And it takes tremendous courage to choose vulnerability. So some of you are like, okay, I get it. I really want more of this in my life. So what does that mean? Well, it means at least these 3 things and probably more. So on your notes, first, I have to tell you what I need. That's the first thing. I have to tell you what I need. I remember the first time I heard a marriage counselor or someone speaking on the topic of marriage say that in healthy marriages, you tell each other what you need. I remember being so surprised by that. Certainly wasn't in the marriage that I watched growing up. Is that the marriage that you have? Are you able to honestly tell each other what you need? Here's what I need from you. Is that what you bring into the relationship? It's so challenging to do this. You know, I wasn't raised in a home like this. My family, when we were growing up, we weren't poor, but for whatever reason, we just did not talk about needs. It just was taboo. For instance, the way we would do clothes shopping before school started every year was the same. We would go, in August, we'd go to the store, in high school it was Kmart. So we'd go to Kmart. And I was allowed to buy the cheapest pair of tennis shoes they had, $10 or so. Of course, cheap piece of plastic made in China was never going to make it through the school year, but that's all I got. I got 1 pair of cheap shoes, I got 2 pair of jeans, and then I would get a few shirts, and that was my whole school year wardrobe. We didn't go shopping later. We didn't get, I didn't want clothes for Christmas, so maybe that's my own fault, but I wanted toys. So it was like, that's what you got. And that worked fine for me up until my sophomore year. My freshman year in high school, I weighed 88 pounds. I know precisely how much I weighed because there was a weight class that year. I was a wrestler, and there was a weight class called 98 pounds. And it was 98 pounds, and I weighed 10 pounds less than it. So it was hard to find kids light enough to wrestle me. So only Ruthie Leonard was smaller than me my freshman year in high school. I was incredibly small. And then I hit a growth spurt between my sophomore and junior year, and I grew 1 foot in 1 year. So that's really cool. It's like, hey, that's a blessing and a curse, because all of a sudden I'm tall. It's like, yeah, I like being tall. But all of a sudden my pants don't fit. Thankfully, I had bought one pair really long and I grew into them. The other pair, they fit when my growth spurt started. So in a short time, they didn't fit. They were like high water pants. You ever had a high water pants? I didn't have any choice. I would wear the good pair that fit until I couldn't stand the smell of them anymore. And then I would take them off and give them to mom to be washed. I wish I'd have known how to do my own laundry, or even asked, can I do my own laundry? I didn't even think of it, but because I'd have just washed them all the time, because I hated and was ashamed when I had to wear the high water pants. But it never even dawned on me to say to mom and dad, hey, could I have money to buy another pair of pants? It never even crossed my mind. You didn't do it. You didn't do it. And heaven forbid you wreck a pair of jeans, you get a ink stain. I remember one year I got an ink stain on them. I wore that ink stained pants for the rest of the school year, because that's what you did. And you just didn't say what you needed. You just did without. And so what's behind that? Many of you have the same story. You just didn't ask for what you needed. It wasn't a want, it was a need. Well, I read this, and I thought this was great. Some people, it's because they think, I have no need of anyone because I can do anything, and that's just pride. It's like, I'm self-sufficient in myself, I don't need anyone else. And that certainly developed for me in the home that I was raised in. If it's to be, it's up to me. If I want something, I gotta go earn it. You don't ask anyone for what you need, you just figure it out and do it yourself. Some of you, that's how you were raised. Pros and cons to that. Bad if you want to be vulnerable. But there's another side to this that's a little darker. Look at this. Some of you were raised in homes where the message sent to you was, my needs aren't worthy enough to even bother anyone. And that's why you don't talk about what you need today. Because you don't think it really matters anyway. They're just your needs. So vulnerability is the key to connection. Vulnerability means being honest about your needs. So let me ask you, are you able to talk about the things that you need? Does your spouse know what you need? Do your friends know it? Are you able to have that conversation with them and tell them what you need? Are your parents open to hearing what you need? The second part of vulnerability, and by the way, there's 3 parts to this I'm going to be talking about. Some of you are going to find some of these, I'm okay with that one. What I've seen, even with people who are not vulnerable at all, is sometimes they're good at one of these, but maybe not, but one is really absent. And vulnerability means you bring these to the relationship. Okay, so the second one. I'll be honest about my failures and my weaknesses. Ugh. I'll be honest about my failures and weaknesses. So if I'm going to be vulnerable, I'm going to tell you what I need. Vulnerability means saying, I need this. I need this from you. That is a vulnerable thing to say. Vulnerability means being able to be honest with you and say, I just blew it here. I'm really struggling with this. I'm not very good at that. So these are vulnerable comments. And we don't do vulnerability in America. And this was driven home in a unique way. I was reading this article. I love this story. The guy said this. Put a slide up like this. Are you above or below average in each of the following areas? And I want you to think about this. Are you above or below average in your ability to get along with other people? Oh, I'm above average in that one, right? How about your honesty? Way above average. How about your work ethic or your intelligence or your morality? You above average or below average in any of these? Now, the guy who was writing this said he's done this countless times he switched the questions around, doesn't matter if the group is large or small, the answer is always the same. Nobody is ever below average in anything, which of course is statistically impossible. Some of us are average and some of us are below average and we can't even say it. We just don't do vulnerability in America. I'm above average in everything. Okay, no you're not, and we all know it. I mean, it's really vulnerable to say, I'm below average in that area. That's just not my strength. That's vulnerability, because you can't control the outcome. Vulnerability, say, I'm just not good at that. That's vulnerable. Or how about this one? It's vulnerable to say, I just blew it, and what I did was wrong, and I'm really sorry. Now, I know that if I really wanted to get you all talking, all I'd have to do is say, how many people how many of you know someone in your life who has never said those last words to you? Never. Some of you as a parent, some of you as a spouse, some of you as a friend in your life. They are never wrong, ever. Because it takes tremendous vulnerability. You can't control the outcome. You can't control what they're going to say or do when you say that. So we put on this illusion, this veneer of perfection. We are not perfect, right? It takes tremendous courage to be vulnerable. The interesting thing is the church was intended to be a place where people could be vulnerable. We know that because it's how Paul talked. Paul wrote half of the books of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, 13 of the 26 books. You want to see how vulnerable he was? In one of his letters to the church in Rome, look at what he said to them. He said, you want to know what I'm like? He said, I'm unspiritual. I'm not spiritual, I'm unspiritual. I feel like I'm sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I don't do that. But what I hate, I do. I mean, talk about honesty. He's writing to the church in Rome and saying, I feel like I'm sold as a slave to sin. So sin is when we are acting in unloving ways. This is the simplest definition. We violate God's standards. God says, this is right, this is wrong. He's like, I want to do this, but I keep doing this. Over and over again, I am unspiritual. It's like I'm sold to this. What I want to do, I don't do. I do this that I don't want to do. And this is tremendous honesty. And people would fall over dead if in half the churches around the country, if the pastor stood up on a Sunday and said, that's me. I don't do what I want to do. I do wrong all the time. It's like, no, we can't do that. We got to be fake. We got to be pure. We got to be perfect. We got to be perfect. We're not perfect. And that's why we don't recover. Years ago, if you live long enough, you see the church go through these kind of trends. It's like, this is really trendy. For years, accountability, getting in accountability relationships was like the thing you read about in articles and saw people speaking about it. Got to get in accountability. So churches, and I was one of them, we were starting accountability relationships and talking about that. And then we started life groups and get people into accountability. And they failed over and over and over and over and over and over again. You know why? Because there is no accountability without vulnerability. Zero. It's why every successful recovery group begins with vulnerability. Does it take any vulnerability to stand up in a room full of strangers and say, my name is Brian and I'm an alcoholic? Does that take any vulnerability? Tremendous vulnerability. Because you can't control the outcome. And that's where real healing and real life change takes place. It doesn't happen in the church because we don't drive in vulnerability. We don't start with vulnerability, so we aren't going to change. You can meet and pray together with someone for the rest of your life from here to kingdom come, but if you aren't vulnerable, there is no positive change. That's why it fell apart. How easy is it for you to be vulnerable about the things you struggle with and the weaknesses in your life? I mean, jeez. And if this isn't hard enough, boy, then let's go on to the third one, right? Guys are just loving this message. If I'm going to be vulnerable, I must be honest about my feelings. Oh, for goodness sakes. Every guy in the room just goes, oh. It's hard enough to talk about my needs or my failures, but now you want to talk about my feelings? No, I draw the line here. And look at the examples I put on the slide. I got to talk about the things that make me feel embarrassed or ashamed, the fears that I have in my life, the things that make me feel anxious, or the things that make me feel joyful or disappointed. I mean, just don't want to do this. Just being honest, I don't want to do it. As I said when I started the series, Jesus is really the model for this. He is the model for what it means to be a man. And he was vulnerable. On the night he was betrayed, he took his best friends, Peter, James, and John. He said, come follow me. Went into the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew the cross was coming. And look what he said to them. He took them with him. And he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Those are emotions, right? And look what he said to them. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. So here's how I feel. I feel like dying. And I want you here with me. Any vulnerability in that sentence? Tremendous vulnerability. I talked last week about one of the most disappointing stories from my career, experiences from my career so far. I hired this young man once. He was so good at what he did. Super talented, great guy, great young man. Loved him. Worked with me for, about a year and a half. And then one day he told me he was leaving, and I was so disappointed. But I was really confused when he said one of the reasons why he was leaving was because he said he couldn't connect with me. And he told me that I was a lot more vulnerable on the stage than I am in person. And I was so confused by that. I didn't know what he meant. Not at the time, I do now. You see, I was not vulnerable for most of my life. I was not vulnerable. When I was the pastor at Hidden Valley, in the church before this one, I wasn't vulnerable. I didn't do vulnerability. Occasionally I do it from the stage if it would fit into my teaching, but that was me doing vulnerability, not being vulnerable. And the staff didn't see vulnerability. Because, quite honestly, it was terrifying to be vulnerable. Here I was a pastor of one of the largest churches in America. 99% of churches will never break 1,000, and we did it repeatedly. Pastor of one of the largest rural multi-site churches in the country, with helping to pioneer video venue at a time when we started, less than 1% of churches were doing that, and we were a part of it. And things growing and things so strong and so good. And I'd been invited I got to speak as the featured keynote speaker at a conference on rural churches, and then I got to speak at Christian colleges, and opportunities were opening up for me. And so it looked like from the outside in that I am so successful, like everything is going right in Brian's life, but inwardly that wasn't true. You want to know the truth? Want to know what he was sensing that he never heard from me? I was terrified. I was terrified. Pretty much from 2004 on. The church grew so fast, and I was terrified that it had outgrown my ability to lead it, and that one day everybody would see that and say, yep, he can't lead this. And sermon prep was so hard for me. It takes me twice as long to write a message as it does most other pastors. And every time I'd read that, the message was, see, you're not very good at this. And I was afraid one day everybody would say, yep, look at him, he's not very good at this. And sometimes people did say that. And I was afraid that I wasn't smart enough to lead it. And I was afraid about hiring wrong, and I was scared to death about correcting staff and confronting them, because sometimes that was part of the job, and I was scared about where the next blow was coming about, and I was really scared about the fact that there were 11 people on the staff. 11 people who depended on me for their income, or at least part of their income, and it was terrifying to me. What if I blow it? What if I make a mistake? These families will fall apart, and I was so overwhelmed with fear. You think I told that to anybody? One person in my life knew part of what I just told you. Nobody else knew. I kept that secret. I was not going to be vulnerable because, I can't control the outcome. They might look at me and say, when I say I'm scared this is growing beyond my ability to lead it, and they might go, yep, it has. We've thought that for a while. Thanks for saying it. There's the door. Vulnerability is terrifying. It's not weakness. It is incredibly courageous, and only the bravest will go there. But my lack of vulnerability was extremely costly to me. I just fantasized about running away constantly. I wanted to quit and leave so bad, from 2004 on. Matter of fact, my journal entries, I reread my journals 4 years ago from that time, is so sad. I literally have a journal entry where I begged God to please let me get fired because I just couldn't do it anymore. I was so certain I was going to fail. I was going to let the church down. I was overwhelmed. That's how I felt. You think I could tell anyone that? Here's the thing you need to remember. You are only as sick as your secrets. That was my secret. That was my secret. Who do you let in? Who knows how you feel? What's going on inside of you? The things where you feel weak, or struggling, or broken, or scared. You want to know why we're so lonely? Why people are killing themselves at record rates? Why we don't connect? It's because we don't risk vulnerability. There is no connection without vulnerability. And this is hard to do. So that's the first piece. Now, what I had planned here when I was prepping is that I would talk then about how to really use vulnerability in your connection with God. I'm going to move that to next week, do an entire message on it. Because I want to go into one more thing today. So on your notes, You can jump down to point number 6. I'm only going to cover this with you. You got to make it safe for someone to be vulnerable with you. This is what I really want to emphasize. So I've just spent all this time talking about vulnerability, but here's the thing. Vulnerability is catastrophic if they don't receive it well. It really, really, really can hurt you to do this. I told you the story last week about a 4th grade boy. I was a 4th grader when my life was upside down, so much pain, so much hurt, and I took a risk with my 4th grade teacher to let him into just a little bit of the pain that I was carrying as a 4th grade boy, to let that wall down a little bit, and he laughed at me. I put that wall up so hard, no one was going to hurt me like that again, and I lived for the next 30 years of my life well protected behind a wall. And that was so costly because you don't just block other people's ability to hurt you. You block your ability to love and to feel joy and to be loved yourself. And here's what I want you to know. I want you to really listen to this. I want you to understand this sentence. Okay? How you respond when someone risks vulnerability with you will determine the quality of that relationship. How you respond when someone risks vulnerability with you will determine the quality of your relationship from that day forward. If you don't handle it the right way, you will lose the opportunity to be vulnerable with them, and your relationship will begin to settle for, because that's what some of you have. You have a settle for marriage. You got a settle for parenting relationship. You don't have what you are capable of having. You're settling for. It's because you can't handle this. And so I want to show you some stuff from the research of Brene Brown. Let me show you this. First, let's start when a woman wants to be vulnerable. Here's what you need to know. So shame for women is rooted in this message that is present in our American society, which says, women, here's what you need to do. You need to do it all. You need to have the career. You need to be a great housekeeper, and you need to raise the kids. You need to do it all. You need to do it all perfectly. You need to make it look effortless. There was actually a commercial years ago that said, never let them see you sweat. Never let them see you sweat. Some of you remember that, right? Never let them see you sweat. It's like you got to do it all, and the person was doing it all, and their armpits weren't sweaty. It's like, yeah, that's women. That's the message of perfection for women. You have to be perfect. You have to be perfect and do it all perfectly. And so when a woman isn't perfect and they risk being vulnerable about their imperfections, here's what has to happen. Men, pay attention. Responding to a woman's vulnerability, you gotta do not try to fix it. Do not try to fix it. Instead, you want to listen and understand and validate how they're feeling. So you listen and you say, oh, that must be really tough for you. I understand what you're saying, and I'm so sorry you're going through that. That's validating it. You're saying the emotion is legitimate for them. Not for you, but for them. Validation has nothing to do with you. It's all about them. Listen, understand, validate. And I thought there was one part in that sentence there that I thought was really important. So I wanted to emphasize it and take the subtlety out of it. So do not try to fix it. Now, some of your men are like, okay, yeah, I'll write that down. Don't try and fix it, right? You got it, right? You think you do. You think you do? Let me test that a little bit. Take a look at this video right here.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless, and I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way.
It's not about the nail. It's not about the nail. It's not about the nail. Because typically when men are listening to their teenage daughters or their wife or somebody talk about it, it's like, this is so dumb. You can solve this and ta-ta-ta-ta. If you do that, you destroy that. You destroy intimacy. Because they don't need your pithy little answers. You think they can't figure that out on their own? For goodness sakes. So again, what do? You listen to them. You try and understand what it's like to be them. Because if you were them, listen, this is what you need to understand about this. If you had lived the life they've lived to that point, you would feel exactly the same as they do. Now, I know that sounds incredible because you can't ever imagine feeling that way, but you're not them. And that's the point, is you try to understand what it's like for them to be experiencing this, and you validate the emotion when you see it. That's what you're doing. So how easy is this for you to do? Are you good at this? You're capable of it. You can do this. Listen, understand, validate. Listen, understand, validate. That's what you have to do. Don't fix. Now, what about for men? Men, this is really tough. Women, I want you to understand what it's like to be a man in American society today. So men have this shame message that's triggered when we are, because the message of America is never be perceived as weak. Any perception of weakness is going to bring shame. This is really important for you to understand. This is the world that I grew up in. This is the world that we live in today. Men have to be strong. That's what we get to be. We get to be strong. We don't get to be weak. And any sign of weakness and vulnerability to men is weakness. Any sign of weakness brings shame. So what happens when a man risks this vulnerability with his wife or with someone else? You must not look down on them. You must not pull away from them. Just listen and understand and validate their feelings. Here's why I'm saying this, okay? One of the guys I read about one guy who said this. He said, my wife, she wants me to be vulnerable, but she can't stomach it. She can't handle it. When I'm vulnerable, it permanently changes the dynamic in the relationship. She says, I want openness. I want intimacy. But if I go there, she pulls away. That is so true. You have to deal with whatever it is inside of you. Well, I know what it is. There's this common saying. When a man loves a woman, she becomes his weakness and he becomes her strength. And so when her strength expresses weakness, it rattles her. She can't handle it. And so all the stuff that we desperately need in that moment, we do not get. We just need what everybody needs, to be listened to be understood, and to have our pain matter. I was really struck by this. Brene Brown was doing an interview. She was being interviewed on a podcast, and she told this story. She said one time she was doing a book signing, and this family came through. It was a husband and his wife and 3 daughters, and so they all had books, and they got signed. And he said, just a minute, I want to talk to Brene. And he said, I really like your material, but you write about women and shame. And she said, yeah, that's what I do. I only write about women. And he said, that's convenient. And that kind of stung her a little bit. He said, we men, we have shame. We have deep shame. But when we reach out, when we're vulnerable, and we tell our stories, we get the emotional crap beat out of us. And before you say anything about those mean fathers, or those coaches, or those brothers, or those bully friends, and he pointed at his wife and daughters, and he said, my wife and 3 daughters, the ones you just signed books for, they had rather see me die on top of my white horse than to have to watch me fall off. And he walked away. Now, I was listening to this on a podcast, and when he said that sentence, I burst into tears. Because I felt like in my life, the first 46 years was summed up in one sentence. So many people would rather have had me die on my white horse than get off it. So many people. I just told you about a time when I wasn't vulnerable. When I wasn't being vulnerable about my fears and anxieties about leading a church that big and that growing that fast. But I did not. And I didn't share my vulnerability, but there were other things going on where I was vulnerable. From 2004 on, I started having serious physical symptoms, things that were affecting me. I actually have some of the journal entries and some of the emails that I sent, because I risked telling people this. The leaders of the church knew, and obviously my wife knew. I started talking about, from 2004 on, how much pain I was in physically. I started having chest pains from 2004 on. Sometimes, and especially towards the end of my time there, 2016, it got so severe that there were times that it would make me gasp out loud. I started having tingling in my left hand and the fingers, and I thought, I'm having a heart attack. I went to the doctor 3 times, and every time it's like, I can't find anything wrong with your heart. On top of that, I started having dizzy spells. I would have dizzy spells that were so severe. One time I couldn't even get out of bed for 45 minutes until the dizziness passed, and then I was able to stand up and move. I had ringing in my ears constantly. I had fatigue that was so bad. I remember one time I came home after preaching. I fell on the couch to sleep, and I lay there, and I couldn't sleep, but I was so hungry, and I wanted to get up and go in the kitchen and eat, and I could not make my feet move. I could not make myself get up. It scared me. It's like, what is happening to me? The only way I could function every single day was I would drink just gallons of caffeine. For a long time, my habit was 2 liters of Diet Mountain Dew a day, until I'm like, that's not good for me. And so I switched to 2 or 3 cans or more every day, and then cups and cups of coffee. And then the only way I could sleep at night was NyQuil. I would go through a bottle of NyQuil at least a week. And from 2004 on, I started telling people, this is killing me. I'm physically not okay. One time I had to cancel a class because I physically could not do it. And I wrote and told the leaders, here's what I'm experiencing. There I was vulnerable. And vulnerability just weirds people out, freaks them out. They don't know what to do with it. I was actually telling one person in my life that I'm pretty sure I'll be dead in 3 years. And nobody did anything. One of the leaders who knew for years how sick I was told me that he just thought one day he would get a call from my wife telling me that I'd had a heart attack and died. Shouldn't there be more to the sentence than that? Shouldn't that be like the first part of the sentence? And the second part is, so therefore, here's what we're going to do to save your life. And that part never happened. It was like my pain that I'm telling them repeatedly again and 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 again, which is killing me, didn't matter. And again, I was stubborn, and I had my own will, and I was scared, and I didn't have an answer. But the reality is, when I heard that sentence, they'd rather have me die on top of my white horse than watch me fall off. That's exactly how I felt. My value was determined by my performance. And the day I quit, the day I said, I am not performing anymore, I was done. They were done with me. And I get there's so much more wrapped up in it because it was the end of my marriage, not just the end of that job, but I was done. And the losses were staggering. People turned away in anger constantly. Even one of my own family members to this day has never spoken to me. He would certainly rather have me have died on that white horse than get off and save my life. Yeah. This is what it's like to be a man and to risk vulnerability. It's terrifying. And even when you do risk it, it doesn't mean anything. Because weakness is not handled in men. Men don't get to be weak. And what we all need is the same thing. We need, like one author said, we need empathy and acceptance from others to move beyond our fears and the pain we carry. Some of you women, you got to understand, your husband, he is carrying something, and if you don't make it safe for him to tell you, he'll never tell. And maybe he'll tell someone else. And if they handle his vulnerability well, then that relationship will begin to grow, not with you. I know some of you listen to me, this is really hard because this is deep pain for you. Some of you reality-wise, some of you, your marriage is ending. But what I want to say to you is your fake marriage is ending. Because that's all it is. You're not vulnerable. There are 1,000 things you have not said to them. So your fake marriage is ending. Your fake marriage is ending. Some of you, this is why you're so lonely, is because you don't do vulnerability. Some of you, this is why you are losing your children, is because you don't do vulnerability. You are not honest about where you've screwed up, and you are not authentic, and you are not going to talk about your weaknesses, and you are not going to share what you need. You are not doing that. So you're going to lose your kids. And some of you, all this is doing is revealing that this is a huge need, and you've got to start by talking to a counselor. That's where you need to start. You need to go see someone who you can be honest with. But again, I'll tell you right now, counseling is meaningless until the day you say to your counselor, you want me to tell you the real truth? This is the real truth about this and this and this. And that's when you will start to heal. Because it will not happen if you're fake with a counselor. And everybody who goes to counseling knows that. This isn't easy. I'd pretty much rather talk about any other subject on the planet than vulnerability. I don't enjoy this at all. It's uncomfortable, but I know it is essential for me to be able to connect with others, my kids, my friends, and with God. I have to do this. I have to get better at it. So what's the next step for you? What do you need to do next? Some of you, it's time to have an honest conversation. But I'm telling you, lay some ground rules first. Say, here's what I want. I'm going to talk to you about some things that are really bothering me. I don't want you to respond. I just want you to listen. As a matter of fact, I don't want you to say anything. I just want to be heard. And that's all I want. Can we agree to that? And then you talk. Or maybe if it's just too controversial, too painful, then you need to get somebody else involved. And have that conversation start moving toward vulnerability. Now, some of you are just exploring your faith here with us, and I'm so glad you've decided to watch or to be here with us today. God models vulnerability to us in a dramatic way. If you ever been in love, you ever been in love? Do you remember how scary it was the first time you risked telling them, I love you? Do you remember how scary and terrifying that was? Tremendous fear, right? Because you can't control that outcome. They could say, no, I don't like you that way. They could really hurt you. So the first one to go, that takes tremendous courage. God went first. God said it first. God looked down through time and saw you and said, I love you. And I love you so much, I'll put my money where my mouth is. I will send my son into the world to bleed and die on a cross so that he could pay for the unloving actions you will bring into this world. And I will see you at the darkest moment of your life, and I will still love you, and I will still want you in my family forever. And I will always love you. Let me have you bow your heads. Maybe for some of you today, it's time to begin. It's time to make the decision to let God into your life. He has loved you since before you were born. He's loved you every day of your life. He's loved you in the darkest moment, the thing you were most ashamed of that nobody knows about. He loved you in the middle of that. And the proof of his love is in what he did in sending his son Jesus to pay on the cross for what we've done that's wrong. If you will turn to Jesus, he will forgive you, and you can begin to connect with God. If you want that, with your head bowed and your eyes closed, say something like this in your heart to him. Say, Jesus, I'm turning to you today. I'm turning to you today. I know I've done things wrong all my life. I've been unloving. I don't even need to, I can't hide that from you. But I've heard that you died for me, to pay for my unloving deeds. Please forgive me. Come and make your home inside of me today. In Jesus' name, amen.